Our ongoing coverage around the local government elections. We're live to you from the Results Operations Center of the IEC as we continue watching those results trickle in. Of course, in the backdrop, there are all kinds of conversations to be had. For one, whilst there is still largely a lot of uncertainty around how this election will actually pan out, a lot of the schools of thought are converging around the idea that these regional political organizations are going to have a whole lot more of an influence now than perhaps they've ever had before, at least since our democracy. So, for more perspective, let's bring in our guest, political risk analyst, Mr. Matlala Setlhalogile, who joins us now via our Zoom link from Johannesburg. And Mr. Matlala, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for making time to chat to us. I wonder if I can get your initial impressions of how much of an influence you think the smaller parties, perhaps the regional players, are likely to have, given the trends we're already seeing around how this election actually went.
Morning, Ayanda, and morning to the viewers. Ayanda, I believe that community-led and local regional organization will have much more of a say in this, local government elections for this year. We saw the trend beginning in the 2016 local government election, with most of the municipalities around the country hung. Look, the concentration of the attention was given to mostly metropolitan municipalities, the likes of Ekurhuleni, city of Joburg, city of Tshwane. But less was said about intermediate municipalities, the bigger municipalities that are not exactly metros. You look at the Rustenburg local municipality, for instance. You go in some municipalities in Limpopo provinces. The ANC at the time had lost outright majority in those municipalities. Those municipalities were actually governed through coalition governments. And I believe this trend will continue in this 2021 elections. I think the idea has been that people realize that maybe bread and butter issues that they suffer from or they are confronted with on a daily basis are best suited, or local organizations are best suited to handle those for them.
Absolutely. And I guess with that in mind, speak to us also around what we should make of the differential that we're seeing between how many people rocked up within townships, for instance, versus some of the urban areas. And this is also important to mention because it also has a direct bearing on who essentially has an opportunity to run these metros. In other words, depending on who rocks up to the polls, the political parties themselves will be faced with, I guess, a different outcome around how much of an influence they're actually able to have within various districts.
Thanks, Ayanda. Firstly, I had Privesh earlier speaking on the expected lower than 2016 voter turnout this elections. The voter turnout has been on a decline, whether at national level or at local government elections for the past, I think, 20 years. It does not come as a surprise at all. And one thing that most people ignore, even though we have a democracy in South Africa, is ours a procedural democracy or a substantive democracy. Once we get to understand the nature of our democracy, then we can make sense of the voter turnout trends. Look, procedural democracy in essence is what South Africa has, where we tick boxes. We hold elections every 5 years. We follow procedures and processes and making legislation, all sorts of things. But in terms of, is our democracy meaningfully transforming the people's lives on the ground? Is it really our democracy serving that purpose? This is where you find people that are sitting at home and they're about to go and vote, but something hits them and say, but will I eat this vote? Will I eat elections? That is the nature of a substantive versus procedural democracy. I've heard people talk about voter apathy. Look, voting is a right, and I believe that right should be exercised responsibly. When an individual actively and deliberately takes an action or a decision rather, not to vote, that is a deliberate inaction. For me, it's not voter apathy, but a well-thought action. Most people just believe that people didn't show up to the polls. They are pathetic. It's not necessarily the case. there was a thought process that actually this person or this individual underwent for them to actually come to a conclusion that, look, I am not going to vote this year. That is, for me, is not voter apathy, but a deliberate inaction. And for me, that's part of actually participating in political processes. Protest is part of the main ways in which people or voters can engage our political processes.
Sure. At which stage do we start being worried, though, Matlala, around whether or not a lack of support, for lack of a better term, at the polls poses a risk to the integrity of the vote itself? I mean, there's already discussions around whether or not we can consider this really to be the voice of the people, at least insofar as this process of our democracy is concerned.
And I'd like to point out that, look, lower voter turnout is not an exclusive preserve of South Africa. Many democracies around the world actually suffer from, less than desired voter turnout. But what is of significance is that South Africa, even though we can consider it a democracy, the democratization process cannot be considered, cemented. So it should pose a serious concern for South Africa that while our democracy is not yet solidified, we're already experiencing lower voter turnout. But the counter-argument here could be that maybe this is an indictment on the system where people say, look, the current governing party has not served its purpose, have not delivered based on its mandate. And existing alternatives of existing opposition parties are not an alternative. We have countries around the world where you get to the ballot paper and there's a none of the above option that's given to voters. Don't you think maybe it's time that we relook at some of the legislation and the designs to offer voters such an option? Do we believe that maybe the voter turnout would have been much lower or higher if such options were actually, explored?
Absolutely. Well, you raise many interesting questions, and I imagine the IEC in some instance will have an interest in at least pondering some of those questions that you raise, even though you raise them sometimes rhetorically. Thank you so much for your indulgence. Really do appreciate it. Matlala Setlhalogile is a political risk analyst joining us there via our video link in Johannesburg.